A former KGB defector warned us about this decades ago. Not about spies sneaking across borders, but about psychological warfare, slow demoralization, and a society trained to mock its own instincts. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. If you're slow, that's okay. I am too, actually. It came in handy, as stated by Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow. That's his book. Thinking Fast and Slow is about two systems of thinking. Human cognition, running on system one. That's fast, automatic, intuitive. And it's really rapid. This is all about dealing with the saber-toothed tiger, dealing with immediate threats. And then there's system two, and that's slow, deliberate, analytical. So most daily judgments are driven by system one, often without any awareness. Cognitive bias is the default. System one relies on heuristics, that's mental shortcuts that are efficient but error-prone. Biases like anchoring, availability, and representativeness, that's systematically distorting judgment. Overconfidence is widespread. People routinely overestimate their understanding and predictions and abilities. Confidence often reflects coherence of a story, not accuracy of facts. Losses hurt more than gains. So this is about loss aversion. It shows that losses are psychological and they're weighted about twice as much as gains, which is interesting. So people are aiming for basically reducing or eliminating loss while being really not aware of what's going to help with gains. This is shaping risk-averse or risk-seeking behavior depending on the framing. That's a whole lot of words, but basically people are thinking fast a lot of the time. Then there's the small subsect of people that I want in my unpaid life, people that I prefer in my paid life, but I can't always get that. And that's people who want to understand things with a slow perspective of system two. This is basically people ignoring the planning fallacy, individuals and organizations consistently underestimating the time that's required, the cost that's required, and the risk by ignoring base rates and historical data. This is the experiencing self versus the remembering self. All right. People judge life events by peaks and endings rather than total experience, and this leads to flawed evaluation of happiness and suffering. Implications? Well, you get better decision making if you go into slowing down and using base rates and other ways. I just want to shout out to Bezmenov of the School Sucks podcast, leaving a link in the show notes here. He did this amazing show back in 2016 with the phenomenon of suddenly, to Brett's surprise and many people's surprise, but not my surprise, of Trump getting elected and the beginning of this new disease called TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome. And that surprised him and others to some degree, but it was very predictable. I want to link, though, to his amazing work, his profoundly important podcast in the show notes. It took years to realize how many ways that I've been fooled or had my perceptions managed. So I just want to say, maybe you kind of suck at researching the last 100 years of perception management, aka propaganda or mind control. This has been going on USA, Europe, pretty much every country, partly because I didn't realize it, you didn't realize what was happening to our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, and ourselves via the media and indoctrination, the things that were available to each generation, books, schools, radio, broadcast television, cable TV, and now social media and internet video platforms. So let's slow down. A quick way to catch up is to find G. Edward Griffin on YouTube and the Rumble. Start with young Ed Griffin in 1968. He's explaining how communism is just another seductive flavor of collectivism. I would say the important thing is to consume that video first and then go on to his interview of Norman Dodd of the famous Reece Commission. This is, I believe, 1980. and then finish it up with his infamous interview with ex-KGB operative Yuri Besmenov. Now, here's why all of this matters and why you need to watch that in this order. First, G. Edward Griffin, More Deadly Than War, The Communist Revolution in America, 1968. Got the YouTube link in the show notes. Why first? Because it establishes the ideological frame before institutions or tactics. Okay, in 120 words, this is a 1968 lecture. Griffin argues that collectivism is not merely an economic or political system, but a moral framework that subordinates the individual to an abstract, quote, greater good. He traces collectivist thought through Marxism, Fabian socialism, and technocratic planning, claiming its appeal lies in moral language, fairness, equality, security, while its practical outcomes concentrate power and reduce personal agency. Griffin emphasizes that collectivism spreads less through military conquest and more through cultural adoption, education, media, and policy norms. The core warning is that once individual sovereignty is reframed as selfishness and centralized control is reframed as compassion, democratic societies can be transformed from within without citizens realizing the trade-offs until after their freedoms have already eroded. Video number 2. Norman Dodd, interviewed by G. Edward Griffin. The Hidden Agenda for World Government, produced in 1990, but the interview was 1982. Why is this important? Okay, in 100 words, Griffin interviews Norman Dodd, former research director of the Reese Committee, who claims that major tax-exempt foundations were deliberately steering education, law, public policy, all of that toward centralized global governance. Dodd recounts statements he says that were made by the foundation officials asserting that democratic consent was an obstacle to long-range planning and must be managed indirectly. The film frames philanthropy as a strategic lever, shaping elites, curricula, and policy assumptions decades ahead of visible political change. And that brings us to today's episode, 007. Made You Think show, Spies Who Like Us, Yuri Besmenov was right. Not to be confused with the movie, Spies Like Us. Bezmenov was interviewed in 1984, but 1 year later, Spies Like Us was released as a satire of modern spy films that offered some hidden and overt messages. So here's my glib, made you think 007 ready take. This is a half movie recap and half propaganda decode. Spies Like Us, 1985. This is a movie with Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase. Is what happens when Cold War anxiety puts on a Hawaiian shirt and pretends everything's fine. Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase play two painfully average American guys accidentally promoted into CIA spies and then immediately shipped off to the Soviet Union to trigger a nuclear incident by mistake. And that's the joke, except it's also the message. On the surface, it's slapstick, incompetence, dick jokes, and oops, we almost started World War III. Underneath, Spies Like Us, the 1985 movie, is soft-serve propaganda doing three clever things at once. Minimizing elite culpability. Nuclear brinksmanship isn't driven by planners or doctrine. It's framed as a comedy of errors. If things go wrong, hey, it was just an accident. Nobody's really in charge. Relax. Next step is humanizing the system. The CIA isn't sinister or strategic. It's goofy, bureaucratic, and well-meaning. Power looks clumsy, not calculated. That disarms suspicion better than denial ever could. Next step, normalizing existential risk. Nuclear annihilation becomes a punchline. Missiles are props. The audience laughs while absorbing the idea that total destruction is just background noise. The insight I want Made You Think viewers to register right now: comedy is often the delivery mechanism for normalization. If you can laugh at something, you stop interrogating it. Spies Like Us didn't make Americans pro-war. It made them comfortable living under permanent threat and trusting that the adults would somehow handle it, which ironically is the most unrealistic part of the movie. What if the greatest weapon ever used against a population wasn't bombs, but beliefs? What if the goal was never to convince you of a lie, but to confuse you so badly that you stopped defending the truth? A former KGB defector warned us about this decades ago, not about spies sneaking across borders, but about psychological warfare, slow demoralization, and a society trained to mock its own instincts. This isn't left versus right, it's perception versus reality. If you felt something's off, but couldn't quite name it, you're not crazy, you're early. Welcome to Made You Think, episode 007, Spies Who Like Us. Yuri Besmenov was right. This is why it's important to go over that third one of the videos of G. Edward Griffin that I really want the viewers and listeners to this show to go and take in its entirety. Griffin interviews Yuri Besmenov, Soviet Subversion of the Free World Press, Deception Was My Job, 1984. Got the video link in the show notes, but it's easy just to put in Yuri Bezmenov interview, G. Edward Griffin, and you will find it. Here's your 100-word synopsis. Bezmenov outlines active measures, long-term psychological and cultural influence operations aimed at reshaping a society's beliefs rather than defeating it militarily. He describes stages often summarized as demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization, emphasizing education, media, and cultural narratives as primary tools for this engineering. Here's your quick, glib, made you think ready expansion. So it's kind of light on the doom and heavy on levity as best I can, still sharp. Bezmenov wasn't predicting the future. He was describing a rinse cycle. Same machine, different slogans. Yuri Bezmenov's 4 stages of ideological subversion reads less like a sinister master plan and more like the operating manual for human psychology under stress. Stage 1, demoralization. This is where a society slowly forgets what it stands for while becoming very confident about opinions it can't defend. People are taught to distrust their own history, instincts, and elders, and instead to trust credentials, slogans, and vibes. Reality still exists, but it's considered rude. Facts become problematic. Competence is optional. Alignment is mandatory. Stage 2, destabilization. Once people are confused, you jiggle the table. Economy wobbles. Foreign policy makes no sense. Institutions contradict themselves weekly. Everyone feels like they're working harder for less while being told things have never been better. This is when phrases like it's complicated, just trust the process, where those phrases do all the heavy lifting. Stage 3, crisis. Now comes the big oh shit moment. It could be financial, social, medical, security related, dealer's choice. The point isn't the crisis itself. It's that people beg for solutions they would have rejected last year. Think getting everyone to take off their shoes at the airport. Think it's just a shutdown for 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Emergency powers suddenly feel comforting. Speed replaces scrutiny. Dissent becomes selfish. And stage 4, normalization. After the dust settles, the new rules are framed as the way things are now. People adapt quickly. Humans are excellent at surviving inside smaller and smaller cages. The weird part? Many will defend the new normal fiercely, because admitting it was avoidable hurts more than accepting it. Bezmenov wasn't predicting the future, he was describing a rinse cycle. Same washing machine, different slogans. This is why this show exists, not to panic, but to notice when the rinse cycle starts again. Whether you interpret this literally or metaphorically, the interview with Yuri Besmenov functions as a practical manual for recognizing narrative manipulation and ideological conditioning in open societies. Yuri Besmenov was a Soviet journalist. He started as a KGB active measures specialist, became a defector in the late 1970s, and then a public educator in the West. He's got lectures and interviews throughout the 1980s. The focus is on influence operations, not on spies or assassinations. Yuri Besmenov didn't predict events, he described mechanisms. The what? Ideological subversion, aka active measures. This is the long-term shaping of beliefs, values, and institutions, so a society undermines itself. This uses media, education, culture, non-government organizations, incentives, instead of force. The key distinction: propaganda equals message bursts. Subversion equals slow remodeling of reality filters. Where? This is, of course, taking place in Western democracies, media, academia, culture. Today, this is taking place on digital platforms, HR policy, public health messaging, entertainment narratives, non-government organization ecosystems. Bezmenov spoke publicly from 1982 to 1985. He claimed timelines were measured in decades, not in election cycles. I'm going to ask all of the viewers and listeners to compare the timelines that were given by Yuri Besmenov to the generational shifts that you've lived through. Here's the why. It is cheaper and more reliable than war to work through heavy-duty messaging and propaganda. Once beliefs harden, people self-police dissent. Once you control the frame, the facts don't matter. And now we get to the 4 stages, again, going over in a little bit more precision detail. 1, demoralization, a span of about 15 to 20 years. This undermines confidence in culture, history, science, family, and identity. The result? Facts just bounce off of various people, and meaning dissolves. So here's a question for the viewers and listeners. Where do you see contempt for legacy institutions paired with moral certainty? Next step, destabilization. This process takes only about 2 to 5 years. This targets the economy, law, energy, and security. It creates a constant friction and policy whiplash. Here's a question you can ask yourself. So what systems feel permanently in crisis mode to you right now? Stage 3, crisis. This takes weeks or months, as we saw with the so-called pandemic, what I call World War COVID. This can take weeks or months. In that case, so many months that it equaled more than a year. It's a shock event, real or amplified. The public accepts measures that were previously unthinkable, such as shutting down actual businesses everywhere, shutting down the ability for people to go to church, shutting down the ability for people to congregate in public. That's like the First Amendment stuff. Censorship, etc., on various platforms. So what kind of measures did you temporarily accept that never went away? Taking off your shoes in the airport. Glad that thing stopped, but I'm still taking off my belt, still emptying my pockets and getting scanned. This is, of course, moving to stage 4, normalization. New rules become permanent. Dissent is reframed as deviance or danger. So what's now become normal that would have been absurd 10 years ago? Here's some connective tissue for our discussion. Fear, saturation. Cognitive load plus emotional flooding reduces discernment. Moral inversion. Harm framed as compassion. Skepticism framed as cruelty. Institutional capture. Funding, incentives, and reputational choke points. Self-censorship. The end game. No enforcers needed. Now, by the way, Bezmenov may have overgeneralized because he came from Cold War contexts. Social change can arise organically. There's technology and demographics. Not every crisis is engineered, but in this case, it smells like it's engineered to me. Mechanisms can exist without a single puppet master. Yeah, in this case, I would guess that there would be many orchestrating puppet masters who are working in sync. Critical thinking questions for the viewers and listeners. Which of Bezmenov's claims are testable today? Where does fear outperform evidence in public discourse? What incentives reward conformity over curiosity? How do we rebuild critical thinking without paranoia? And By the way, let's take a step back into the man, Yuri Besmenov. His life story and signal distilled down to the important points. His origins and recruitment, born in the USSR to a high-status military family, Yuri Bezmenov entered Soviet elite institutions and was recruited into the KGB's information/active measures apparatus. By the way, question you always ask yourself, who benefits from presenting Bezmenov's pedigree as insider credibility? And what records independently verify it? Bezmenov was posted in India, stationed there under journalistic cover. He worked cultural and media channels, books, exchanges, opinion shaping, rather than classic espionage. He later summarized KGB priorities as 85% psychological warfare, which is demoralization, destabilization, normalization, and 15% traditional espionage. So, Bezmenov was there witnessing the manipulation of intellectuals, students, and media figures, and this reportedly catalyzed his break with the system. He cultivated non-official contacts, avoided surveillance, and sought the Western asylum via diplomatic channels. So, this is important to go over the exact story of how he escaped, which is harrowing and amazing. He escaped India and transited through Greece and received assistance to resettle in North America. Please listen to the escape story right here. We're going to just go ahead and bring it right into Yuri Besmenov's own words.
Well, you told us a moment ago why you left the system. I'd like to hear the details of how you did it. It must have been a very dangerous thing.
It was not so dangerous, it was crazy. First of all, because defecting in India is virtually impossible, thanks to very strong pressure from the Soviet government.
Excuse me, you were in India on assignment at that time.
Yes, I was working for the Soviet embassy in New Delhi as a press officer. And defecting for a Soviet diplomat is next to impossible. It's a suicide, as I said, because a great friend Indira Gandhi pushed a law through parliament which says, and I quote, "No defector from any country has a right of political asylum in any embassy on the territory of Indian Republic," which is a masterpiece of hypocrisy. No other defector but the Soviet one needs a political asylum. So knowing that perfectly well, I planned a craziest possible way to defect. I studied counterculture in India. There were thousands of young American boys and girls with no shoes, long hair, smoking hash and marijuana, studying sometimes Indian philosophy, sometimes simply pretending that they studied. And they greatly annoyed Indian police, and they were laughing stock of Indians because obviously they were good-for-nothing students. I studied carefully where they congregate, what routes they travel, what language they speak, what do they smoke. And one day I simply joined a group of hippies to avoid detection of Indian police. I was dressed as a typical hippie with blue jeans, long kameez shirts, with all kind of nice decorations like beads, long hairs. I bought a wig because for several weeks I had to turn myself from a conservative Soviet diplomat into a very progressive American hippie. And that was the only way that I could avoid detection. It was very interesting experience, but it was necessary because from my own knowledge as a member of Soviet embassy staff, I knew that there were many cases when Soviet defectors were betrayed by Indian police, and also some Western embassies played a very dirty role in betraying the Soviet defectors. According to our information, there were some, I wouldn't call them double agents, but simply immoral people working for the United States Embassy, and confiding in people like this would be a suicide. So I had to be extremely careful. I could not trust anyone, and that was the reason for such a crazy way to defect.
Well, had you been caught in the act of trying to get out, what would have
No.
happened to you?
Oh, most likely I would end up in concentration camp. Or, depending on the situation and on the whim of some bureaucrat in KGB, maybe even executed. This is normal practice. Quietly, of course, not publicly. But that would be the end of my defection, of course.
Well, when did you finally make it to the United States?
In 1970, after about 6 months of debriefing in Athens by the CIA, and I presume FBI too, they let me go first to Germany, then to Canada. That was my decision. I had to change my identity to protect my family and my friends in USSR. And also I was a little bit paranoid, knowing that both Soviet KGB and probably some double agents within the American system may be after me. So I wanted to settle down as far away as possible. I requested CIA to give me some kind of new identity and just let me go on my own. And I settled in Canada.
After Yuri Besmenov resettles in Canada under the name Thomas Schumann or Schulman and entered witness-style protection, he began to do his public warnings. In the 1980s, he lectured widely on ideological subversion, insisting the goal was to change how people think and not what facts they know. Now, how much of the lecture content can be verified against the unedited recordings? Well, go ahead and watch these lectures, I would say, and answer that for yourself. His collaboration with educators, his interviews and talks were popularized through educational media with figures like G. Edward Griffin. Love his interviews. So it's important to think about these things. Admirers of Bezmenov and Griffin saw a prescient warning, and critics argued exaggeration, Cold War bias, or anecdote-heavy claims, but I just see it as accurate. In later life, Bezmenov lived quietly in Canada after his speaking period waned. He reportedly died in the early 1990s. Accounts often cite alcohol-related causes, like he drank himself to death, although documentation is sparse. This is the 90s, after all. You don't have a lot of data to know, but it would be nice to figure that one out. The core claim of Bezmenov: once a population is demoralized, facts no longer matter. Only narrative alignment does. The bottom line: Bezmenov's story is best treated as a testable framework, not a closed legend. You can separate verifiable logistics, dates, aliases, recordings, from the interpretive overlays, and track the incentives of every messenger along the chain. So how does this triad of G. Edward Griffin interviews work together? Okay, it starts with ideas make control feel moral. And that's where just you have Griffin speaking directly to the camera in 1968 in black and white, explaining how collectivism was there to ruin everyone. Step 2, you have institutions make it durable. The interview with Norman Dodd goes over exactly how these powerful institutions, in this case, the Council on Foreign Relations and various other think tanks, make ideas durable. And then stage 3, operations make it invisible. Yuri Besmenov spills the beans on literally perception management that was going on with all of the famous people who met with him in India and famous people who met with all Soviet operatives, all communist collectivist operatives everywhere, to create this thought leader group of people around the world, people who would be educators, influencers, to get the idea to give up all of your potential freedoms for the hope of some security. The USSR didn't collapse because Hollywood mocked it, a la Spies Like Us, or because Bezmenov jinxed it. It collapsed because the system ran out of narrative fuel. By the time Spies Like Us was making nuclear annihilation into a punchline, 1985, and Bezmenov was calmly explaining ideological decay, which was 1984, The Soviet model was already hollowed out. The slogans still worked, the incentives didn't. 5 to 6 years later, what gets called dismantling or corporate restructuring was really a controlled retreat, turning rigid ideological power into flexible managerial power. The same elites, new language, less red banners, more suits. History lesson: systems rarely fall from outside pressure. They rebrand when belief no longer scales. Collapse is messy. Reorganization is quieter and far more common. So, this is pattern recognition. This is not moral absolutism. The Communism in Practice Spectrum 2026 edition. And today, by the way, we're talking January 5th, 2026. The gold medal, China, authoritarian communism with apps. China is the cleanest expression of the model. We have party supremacy, state-corporate fusion, surveillance as public service. You are free to comply. North Korea functions less as an ally and more as a living cautionary tale next door, a geopolitical haunted house reminding Chinese citizens it could be worse. Trajectory: tight control continues. Innovation grows inside the cage. Exit ramps stay locked. Russia. The silver medal, oligarchic state capitalism, post-communist remix. Russia ditched ideology and kept hierarchy. Less Marx, more mafia with flags. Power is centralized, dissent is managed. Markets are allowed until they're inconvenient. Trajectory: strongman stability until succession stress. Less belief-based, more force-based. It is brittle long-term. And the bronze medal goes to the European Union. Bureaucratic soft communism. Not gulags, but forms. Not tanks, but regulations. Property exists, but permission culture thrives. Speech is free until it isn't safe. And then you could see the huge number of incarcerated individuals who all just go into prison because of some social media post. We can put the stats up right here. The trajectory: more control through compliance, less through violence. Citizens don't revolt, they quietly disengage. And now an honorable mention: the United States. Corporate managerial collectivism. Not communist in branding, communist in outcomes. Privatized profits, socialized losses. Moral language as enforcement, corporations as policy arms. The trajectory: two Americas. One plugged into institutions and narratives, one building parallel systems, pods, localism, and exit strategies. How do all of these play out? Hard communism in China tightens. Post-communism in Russia consolidates. Soft technocracy in the European Union regulates. Hybrid chaos in the USA fragments. The twist: the future won't be decided by nations, but by who opts out intelligently without getting crushed. History doesn't repeat, it rebrands. The tease: a former Soviet operative explaining how influence works without tanks. And now for some important advice regarding the consumption of this episode, and most historic and political commentary in general. Overthinking feeds on abstraction. Momentum feeds on contact. The antidote is simple, physical, and social. Regulate your body. Produce something tangible and show up for real people daily. Do that and paranoia fades while health, wealth, and relationships compound. So here's some problems to keep aware of and hopefully avoid the influence. Perception management. This is reality as a managed product. This is controlling the frame, not the facts. This is about being aware of when you are repeating emotionally charged narratives until they feel like common sense. This, unfortunately, gets people to argue inside a preloaded box. Here's the counter move. Name the frame out loud. Ask, what must be assumed for this to be true? Humor helps. Satire punctures authority faster than outrage. Number 2, the Overton window. This is range limiting. The mechanism, this is where, unfortunately, perception managers gradually shift what's sayable and punish those outside of the window. The effect is self-censorship, making that automatic. A counter move, practice window stretching. Step 3, divide and conquer. Be aware of this one. This is horizontal hostility. The mechanism, split people up by identity, ideology, or lifestyle so that they never unify vertically against power. The effect, endless culture skirmishes, no coalition. The counter move, rehumanize. You can learn some nonviolent communication, what I like to call voluntary communication or compassionate communication. This is where you learn to observe, identify your feelings, identify the core values that create those thoughts and feelings, and then make some tangible actions inside of yourself or outside of yourself to lower the threat and restore curiosity, to create internal connection and interpersonal connection. Step 4, be aware of fear saturation. This is cognitive flooding. Mechanism, keep the nervous system in fight or flight with nonstop alerts. The effect is to reduce working memory and create poor reasoning. Here's the counter move. Do some breath work, a la tactical mental emotional hygiene. Box breathing. That's taking a breath in, count to 4, holding it, count to 4, breathing out, count to 4, holding the out breath, count to 4. That's a Navy SEAL popular technique, but it wasn't invented by the Navy SEALs. It was invented before them. This is about physiological size, nasal breathing during news intake, calm first, think second. Step 5, this is about moral inversion or virtue as a weapon. Mechanism, redefine harm as compassion or dissent as cruelty. The effect, ethics is flipped. Compliance is framed as kindness. Here's your counter move. Return to first principles. Ask, so who bears the cost? Is consent present? What would falsify this claim? And step 6, language capture. This is about semantic drift. The mechanism, change definitions mid-conversation. The effect, debates become unwinnable. Counter move, freeze terms. Before we continue, let's define X. Let's define capitalism. Let's define consent. Old school logic beats new school vibes every day of the week. Step 7, authority laundering. This is trust transfer. This is about borrowing credibility from institutions, experts, or consensus without showing primary evidence. The effects are an appeal to authority, replacing reasoning. This is, again, the need for understanding logical fallacies and logic. Your counter move, demand the ladder of evidence. Primary data is greater than methods, which is greater than incentives. And then normalization after crisis, the mechanism, emergency measures linger and harden. This creates temporary measures becoming permanent. Your counter move, sunset clauses in life and policy, regularly reviewing what you accepted for now. And the remedy, it's an inside job for me and you today. Regulate your body before you would regulate the world. This works because anxiety lives in the nervous system, not in the spreadsheet. Here's something to do today. Walk outside in the sunlight, 20 to 40 minutes. Breathe slower than you think you need. Long exhales. Lift something heavy or move with intensity for 15 minutes. The result, your brain exits threat mode. Thoughts get quieter. You stop doom scrolling for meaning and start feeling capable again. The rule is, if your body is calm, your politics shrinks to their proper size. Step 2, build something small, useful, and finished. And why it works? Analysis paralysis dissolves when you complete loops. Something to do today. Cook a real meal. Fix one broken thing. Go ahead. Complete one imperfect output. Make a video post like this one. Send that invoice. Text that offer. Build that garden bed. The result, competence replaces commentary. You relearn that agency exists. The rule is, one finished thing beats 10 important opinions. Step 3, anchor to people, not narratives. Why it works? Fear thrives in isolation. Resilience grows in proximity. Something to do today. Talk to a neighbor. Train with a friend. Host or attend something simple. This is a walk or a meal or a work session. The results, trust returns. You remember that most humans are decent when they're not filtered through headlines. The rule is, strong communities are built by presence, not by posts. Tools and solutions, the rebuild. Learn some emotional balancing skills, such as nonviolent communication and somatic skill sets. Pair this with slow exhales to keep the prefrontal cortex online. Breath work as cognitive armor. You can do 2 to 3 minutes before hard content is consumed. Also, you can do some slow breathing to prevent heated escalation. Here's an important one. Learn the trivia method of critical thinking. That's grammar. What is being claimed? That's the who, what, where, and when. Learn what is logic and what is informal logic. This asks and answers important why questions. Asking, does it follow? Are there any contradictions? And as far as rhetoric or wisdom that is practical and based upon knowledge and understanding, how is emotion being used? How does this work in practical reality? Next step is to learn some of the Stoic skill sets. What is within your control and what is an aspect of what you are concerned with? Control your attention, habits, your tones, your boundaries. Acknowledge concerns without letting them hijack your action or your amygdala. Next, social resilience. Local first. Small, trust-based networks is much greater than mass movements. I want to point to freedomcells.org as a decentralized voluntary model for real-world connection. But you might already have a bunch of real-world connections, so leverage that. The synthesis of all of this. Worrying about grand systems feels responsible, but it often masks avoidance of the only 3 levers that actually change outcomes: your inner state, your actual skills, and your solidarity with real people. Regulate your body. Produce real value. Invest in people you can touch and you care about. Do this daily and you'll notice a pattern. Your health stabilizes. Your wealth becomes practical and bigger, probably. Your relationships deepen. And the noise, it loses its grip because your life finally has traction. I hope you had some good takeaways from this episode. I'm your host, Daryl Becker, just another licensed acupuncturist, trying to make some meaning and purpose from this amazing, beautiful world.
Made you think.